I looked around for an empty table and noticed it in the corner, the quietest and most inconspicuous. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay calm, even though everything inside me screamed that I shouldn't be here. But there was nowhere to retreat. All I had to do was meet with him and find out what my next step would be. Derek appeared a few minutes after me, and his appearance was as cool and confident as ever. There was the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling the situation in his movements. He was dressed in an immaculate suit that fit perfectly on his toned body, which added to his impressiveness. His cold gaze crossed mine, and I felt something tighten inside. I knew that this meeting would change my life, but I still didn't fully understand how much. He came to my table and, without waiting for an invitation, sat down opposite me. The faint scent of expensive cologne enveloped the space around us, and I involuntarily held my breath. Derek was in no hurry to start a conversation, as if he was enjoying the fact that I was at his mercy. His gaze seemed to scan me, assessing every detail, from my expression to the trembling fingers that I tried in vain to hide under the table. "Jesse," he finally spoke, his voice low, even almost soothing. "You look tired. Tough times, huh?" I just nodded, unable to get a word out. My throat was dry, and I noticed how my hand automatically reached for a cup of coffee, which I didn't even have time to order. Derek intercepted my gesture and motioned for the waiter. "Coffee for the lady," he said, not taking his eyes off me, and then added, "Black, no sugar." I was startled. He knew what kind of coffee I was drinking. This small, seemingly insignificant fact threw me off balance even more. In his presence, I felt transparent, as if all my thoughts and feelings were in the palm of my hand. But I couldn't show weakness. I couldn't let him know that he was already winning this game. "Let's not waste time on pleasantries." His voice brought me back to reality. "You're not here to drink coffee." He was right. I knew this from the very beginning, but I still hoped that I could hold out the moment of truth for at least a few more minutes. But Derek is not one to tolerate procrastination. He had clearly come here with a clear purpose and was determined to see the matter through. "The situation is really serious," he continued when the waiter had left. "I know you're desperate, Jesse, but you need to look at things realistically. You need money, and fast. I'm ready to offer you a way out." The only way out. His gaze pierced me, and I realized that now he would announce his conditions. "What do you want in return?" My voice was quieter than I expected, almost a whisper. Derek leaned closer, as if he was afraid that someone might hear our words. His face was serious, but there was something dangerous in his eyes, like a predator ready to strike a decisive blow. "Just a little bit of your time and dedication." He paused, allowing me to process his words. "This is between us, Jesse. No one will know. I will help you get rid of your problems, but in return you will have to perform a small favor for me." My heart skipped a beat. I knew where he was going, but I still hoped he wasn't. That it's just a nightmare that I'm going to wake up from soon. But his calm, confident tone dispelled all illusions. "You want me to—" I couldn't finish the sentence, but Derek understood me without words. "It's just business." His voice became colder. "You'll get your money. I'll get what I need. Everything will be fast and safe." My body tensed like a spring ready to burst with tension. Thoughts swirled in my head. How could I have come to this? How could she be in such a situation? But there was no answer. All I knew was that there was nowhere to retreat. The debts were growing, and every day was worth its weight in gold. If I refuse now, then everything will collapse like a house of cards. "I need to think about it," I finally said, trying to delay the moment of making a decision. Derek chuckled, his smile icy, as if he knew that my thinking was just a temporary pause. He got up from his chair, throwing a business card with a phone number on the table. "You have exactly 24 hours, Jesse." His words sounded like a sentence. "I know you will make the right choice." He left, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the emptiness inside. I sat motionless, unable to move, as if chained to this table. A business card with his name and phone number lay in front of me like a mute witness to what had happened. I took it with trembling hands and put it in my purse, as if that could hide the very reality of what was happening for me. The whole day passed in a blur. I mechanically performed the usual actions. I cooked dinner, cleaned, and helped Tom with his lessons. But every minute Every action reminded me that the most difficult thing was ahead. Paul came home late, tired, but still found the strength to hug me and kiss me on the cheek. His kindness, his care, seemed to only increase my inner pain. I tossed and turned in bed for a long time at night, unable to sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about Derek. I tried to find another way out, another way to pay off my debts, but each time I came back to the same conclusion. I have no choice. I woke up in the morning with a heavy feeling in my chest. After sending Tom to school and saying goodbye to Paul, I was left alone in the house. It was the most terrible feeling, loneliness, when there is no one to support you, when you are on the edge of a precipice. I picked up the phone and stared at Derek's business card for a long time, as if it were a pass to another world, a world where everything is subject to his rules. My heart was pounding so hard that it seemed like its beats could be heard all over the house. I dialed the number several times, but each time I stopped, not daring to press the call button. But the fear of inaction was stronger. Finally, I gritted my teeth and pressed the call button. Yes, Jesse? Derek's voice on the other end of the line was as calm as it had been in the cafe. I agree, I whispered, feeling everything inside me break. His answer was short, as if he had expected it. I'll meet you tonight. He named the time and place, and I wrote them down in a notebook, not fully understanding what I was doing. When the conversation ended, I sat in silence, trying to realize what I had done. But the realization did not come. It was empty inside, as if I had made a decision that had been in the air for a long time, but I couldn't admit it out loud. This evening was the beginning of my end, or perhaps the beginning of something new, unknown, something that will change my whole life. But at that moment, I couldn't know what it would lead to. I just knew there was no turning back. The morning was gray, and the rain was drumming on the windows, as if reminding me that everything in my life had changed. After that meeting with Derek, I couldn't look at the world the same way anymore. Everything seemed somehow wrong, distorting reality, as if I had crossed a line beyond which nothing would be the same as before. I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee in my hands, but instead of the usual aroma and taste, I felt only bitterness. Paul was already at work. Tom was getting ready for school, as usual, chatting nonchalantly about his school plans. His voice, so lively and joyful, seemed to sound somewhere far away, behind the wall. I nodded and smiled, as a mother should, but inside I was seething. I was listening to him, but I didn't hear him. Mom, are you okay? Tom suddenly asked, looking at me with his big green eyes. There was a note of concern in his voice. Of course, darling, it's all right, I managed, trying to sound as natural as possible. Tom shrugged, accepting my answer, and grabbed his backpack and ran to the door. I watched him go, and it was only when the door closed behind him that I allowed myself to exhale. Being alone in the house was both a relief and a curse. I was free from the need to maintain a mask in front of my family, but with it came the realization that I was alone with my demons. I spent the whole day in a kind of foggy state. I tried to distract myself with business, but my thoughts always returned to what had happened. Last night haunted me like a ghost, reminding me that now I belong to a world of lies and shadows, where every mistake I make can cost me too much. The meeting with Derek was like a nightmare. When I entered the room of the hotel where we had agreed to meet, everything inside me shrank with horror. I was on the verge of panic, but I knew that it was impossible to retreat. Derek greeted me with the same cold confidence I'd seen in his eyes at the cafe. He knew I was coming. He knew I had no choice. Jesse, his voice was even, almost friendly, but I saw a cold, calculating consciousness in his gaze. I'm glad you didn't change your mind. I just nodded, unable to say a word. At that moment, everything seemed unreal. The walls of the room with their faceless decor, the soft light of a table lamp, the smell of cheap air freshener. All this merged into a single, oppressive feeling of isolation. Derek didn't waste time talking. He came closer to me, and I felt a chill permeate my body. His hand slid over my shoulder, and at that moment I realized there was no turning back. Everything that I built with Paul, our family, our future, now it's all become ghostly and fragile. When it was over, Derek gave me a curt nod, as if I was just part of his plan, which he had successfully implemented. He left an envelope with money and a piece of paper with the new terms of the deal on the table. His confidence, his perfection, only increased my sense of horror at what I had done. But I took the money and left, realizing that this was just the beginning. Now, sitting at home alone, I tried to realize that this was not just a nightmare, but a reality that I would have to live with. But how? How can I hide this from Paul? How can I look into Tom's eyes, knowing that I betrayed their trust in order to save our familiar world? At that moment, the phone on the table vibrated, pulling me out of my thoughts. I shuddered and looked at the screen. It was Derek. The seconds dragged on like an eternity as I debated whether to answer. Conflicting feelings raged inside me. Fear of what he will say, and an equally strong desire to avoid talking. But ignoring him would be even worse. Yes? My voice sounded weaker than I expected. Everything went as planned. His voice was cold matter of fact. Now we can move on? I was silent, clutching the phone in my hand. What exactly did he mean by moving on? I couldn't bring myself to ask, but I knew the answers would come, even if I didn't want to hear them. I'll get back to you later, Derek continued, his tone leaving no room for objections. The next meeting will be in a week. Get ready. He hung up the phone without waiting for my answer, leaving me in a cold stream of thoughts and fears. Next meeting, I barely made it through the first one. How can I go through it again? I spent the rest of the day as if in a dream. All my actions were automatic, like a machine. I cleaned and cooked, but none of these things brought relief. Every time I saw Paul's things or Tom's toys, the guilt overwhelmed me with renewed force. I tried not to think about what would happen next, but it was impossible. In the evening, Paul returned home. His smile, his concern, seemed even more painful to me now. He didn't notice anything. He was sure that everything was fine, and it was tearing me apart. I looked at him, feeling the wall that I had built growing between us. He hugged me, asked me how my day was, and I told him another lie. "It's okay, darling. I'm just a little tired," I said, smiling, but a storm was raging inside me. We spent the evening together as usual. Paul was cooking dinner, and I was sitting next to him pretending to enjoy the moment. But every word he said, every move he made seemed like a lie to me. I wanted to shout the truth at him, tell him everything, but I couldn't. The fear of him turning away was too great. When Tom fell asleep, Paul suggested watching a movie. I agreed, trying to distract myself from my thoughts, but the plot of the film passed me by. All my thoughts were focused on the fact that I was going to have to go through another meeting with Derek. And not just one. What will happen next? How long can I keep up this lie? Paul, as always caring and attentive, hugged me, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. But I couldn't let them spill. I squeezed his hand, hoping it would give me strength. But all I felt was fear and helplessness. When night fell on the city and Paul fell asleep next to me, I lay for a long time looking at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come, and I was trying to figure out how to move on. I betrayed him. I betrayed our family, but how can I tell him about it? And is it worth it at all? These questions tormented me, but there was no answer to them. It had been a few days since that meeting at the hotel, but the shadows of it still haunted me. I tried to live as before, but everything seemed different. Every time I left the house, it seemed to me that everyone around me knew what I had done. Meetings with friends became torture. Their chatter about the little things of life seemed empty and meaningless to me. They didn't know that I was carrying this weight, and it was both a relief and a torment. My life was divided into two parts. On the one hand, the house, the family, the usual things. On the other, the world that Derek dragged me into. And this second world was pulling me more and more into its nets. But the scariest thing was that I began to get used to this double life. It all started with the little things. The first cracks in the mask I wore in front of Paul and Tom were barely noticeable. It could be casual glances, too long pauses in conversation, minor blunders that had not been noticed before. But now that lying had become a part of my life, every little thing took on enormous weight. I was constantly looking around, as if someone was watching me, ready to expose me. Paul, of course, didn't suspect anything. He was still immersed in his work, and evenings with his family remained a familiar ritual for him, requiring no special changes. But I noticed how his eyes began to linger on me longer. Sometimes he asked questions that would not have been asked before. Are you okay? Is something wrong? These words were steeped in care, but to me they sounded like a sentence. I tried to answer him as before, but I felt that the falsehood was becoming more and more obvious. One evening, when Tom was already asleep and Paul was sitting on the couch with his laptop, looking through work documents, I suddenly felt that I could no longer stand the tension. He asked if I wanted to join him, watch a movie, or just chat. It was so homey, so cozy, that for a moment I almost forgot that I was bursting with fear inside. No, I'll probably go to bed early, I said, trying to sound as natural as possible. You've been very tired lately, Jesse, Paul remarked, looking up from the screen and staring at me intently. Maybe you need to rest? It's okay, I replied, smiling, although I knew the smile was forced. I went into the bedroom, closed the door behind me, and leaned back against it, trying to calm the trembling in my hands. The walls of our house, which had always seemed like a reliable protection to me, were now pressing down on me. Here, in this silence, every rustle, every sound seemed treacherous. I turned off the light and went to bed, but sleep did not come. The thoughts of what was ahead, of what I was hiding from Paul, were too loud to drown them out. I woke up early the next morning. Tom was still asleep, and Paul was going to work. I watched him over a cup of coffee as he tied his tie in front of the mirror. There was nothing unusual about his movements, but I had the feeling that he was feeling something wrong. His attentive eyes were looking in my direction, and I tried my best to hide my feelings. Jesse, he began when he came up to me and bent down to kiss me on the cheek. Are you sure you're okay? You've been kind of distracted lately. Just a lot to do, I replied, quickly turning away so he wouldn't see the expression on my face. It will pass. He looked at me for a few more seconds, but didn't say anything. I could see that something was bothering him, but he decided not to insist. He left for work, and at that moment I felt relief mixed with guilt. When the door closed behind Paul, I was alone again. The silence of the house weighed on me even more than before. At that moment, the phone on the kitchen table vibrated. I flinched as if I'd been caught by the arm and hurried to the phone. There was a message on the screen from Derek. Tonight. Same place, same room. My heart stopped beating. Another meeting. Another lie to come up with. Another role to play. I closed my eyes, trying to calm the rising panic, but nothing helped. I knew I had to go. I had no choice. I spent the whole day in suspense, mechanically doing chores around the house, but every little thing reminded me of what was ahead. I was cooking dinner when Paul came home. He was a little tired but still in a good mood. Usually his presence brought me peace, but now I only felt the pressure build up. I'm going to work late, I said, trying to find a reason to leave home in the evening. We have an urgent project, and I have to be at the office. Paul looked at me with mild concern, but didn't say anything. He was used to the fact that my work sometimes requires extra effort from me, and did not ask unnecessary questions. But I noticed a shadow of doubt in his gaze, and it made me tense up even more. Okay, just don't stay too long, he said, kissing me goodbye when I was already on the doorstep. I'm worried about you. It's going to be okay, I replied, trying to sound confident. I went outside, and the cold evening air immediately made me shudder. I quickly got into the car and drove to the hotel. The road was familiar, but now every turn, every traffic light seemed like a test to me. I drove without taking my eyes off the road, but thoughts were spinning in my head about how long I could continue this lie. When I got to the hotel, my heart started beating faster. I went inside, called the number at the reception, and headed for the elevator. I was seething with fear and anxiety inside, but I tried to hold on as best I could. When the elevator doors opened on the right floor, I took a step forward, and at that moment all the sounds around me became muffled, as if the world had shrunk to one moment. What would happen outside the room door? I knocked. The door opened, and I saw Derek. He met me with the same cold and confident gaze that I was already used to seeing. Nothing had changed in his behavior, as if this was just another business meeting for him. But it became a challenge for me every time. Come in, he said, stepping back to let me in. I walked in, feeling like my legs were getting wobbly. The room was the same as the last time, but now it seemed even more alien to me, as if it was a place where reality was distorted, losing its familiar outlines. Derek didn't waste time talking. He was looking at me, waiting for me to make the first move. And I made it. This moment, when I crossed the threshold, when I allowed myself to enter his world, became a point of no return for me. I knew that now all my fears were real, but I couldn't stop. When it was over, Derek became the same cold and calculating man again. He left another envelope on the table, which contained part of what he promised me. But money no longer brought me relief. Now they were a reminder that I had betrayed everything that was dear to me. "We'll meet again," he said as I was about to leave. "You know what to do." I nodded, unable to look him in the eye. My insides were bursting with horror at what I had done. But I had no choice. I left the room, feeling a cold shiver run through my body. In the hallway, I stopped for a moment to collect my thoughts, but they were shattered like pieces of a mirror reflecting my fears and guilt. When I got home, Paul was already asleep. I went quietly into the bedroom, trying not to wake him up. But when I lay down next to him, his hand automatically reached out to me, as if even in a dream he felt my presence. I squeezed his hand, trying to find some kind of comfort in this gesture, but I didn't feel anything. Every new day was getting harder. Paul continued to take care of me. Tom was still happily running around the house, but I no longer felt like a part of their world. A few more days passed, and I realized that soon everything would collapse. I had a feeling inside that I was standing on the edge of a precipice. One wrong step, and my whole life, all the lies I've been weaving, will break into pieces. I didn't know how long I could hold out, but I knew the end was near. Everything seemed quieter at night, but I knew that this calmness was deceptive. Every sound seemed louder than it really was, and every rustle made me wince. Paul was sleeping next to him, his steady breathing filling the room. I couldn't sleep. My head was spinning with thoughts of how far I had come. Finally, I decided to get out of bed and headed into the living room to try to find some solace alone. I turned on the light and sat on the couch, hugging my knees with my hands. My gaze darted around the room, as if I was looking for something that could answer all the questions. But the only thing I saw was emptiness. The emptiness that filled my life. The phone rang. At this time of night, the call seemed wrong, and I immediately felt my heart tighten with fear. Derek's name appeared on the screen. I didn't want to answer, but I knew I couldn't ignore him. "Yes?" I whispered, barely able to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Jesse, we have a problem." His voice was cold and calm as always, but I sensed something new and disturbing in it. "We need to meet. Immediately." "What happened?" I asked, unable to hide my concern. "I'll explain everything on the spot. Come to the same hotel. In an hour." He hung up the phone without waiting for my answer. I sat still, trying to figure out what could have gone wrong. Why was he calling me in the middle of the night? What kind of problem could arise? Thousands of thoughts were spinning in my head, but none of them gave an answer. I knew I had to go. She put on her coat, glanced at the sleeping Paul, and for a moment wondered if she should wake him up, tell him everything. But the fear was stronger. I left the house, quietly closing the door behind me, and headed for the car. The drive to the hotel was short, but it seemed endless. I was driving on autopilot, not noticing any cars or people around. When I got to the hotel, dawn was already beginning, and the gray sky reflected my mood. I went up to the right floor, and as soon as I got to the room door, it suddenly opened. Quick inside, Derek ordered, his face tense. I walked in and immediately felt that something was wrong. There was a tense atmosphere in the room. Derek was standing by the window, nervously fiddling with his phone. His usual calm was disturbed, and that scared me the most. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to figure out what had caused such a drastic change in his behavior. He looked at me and finally said, "Someone found out about us, Jesse. We are under surveillance." These words sounded like a bolt from the blue. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What do you mean? How can anyone find out?" "I do not know, but it is a fact. I have received threats and messages from unknown numbers. Someone is playing with us, and I'm not going to wait for it to get out of control." I felt a chill run through my body. Everything that I had been hiding so carefully was in danger of being revealed. Panic began to take hold of me, but Derek suddenly grabbed me by the shoulders. His face was very close. "You have to leave the city. he said softly but insistently. It's the only way out. What? Leave? How can I do this? I couldn't believe what he was saying. If you stay, everything will end badly. For both of us, his words were full of cold determination. I'll take care of your disappearance. But you have to leave now. My thoughts were confused. I couldn't imagine leaving Paul and Tom, but she understood that every moment of delay could lead to disaster. What's going to happen to you? I finally asked. Don't worry about me. The main thing is that you were safe. At that moment, the door of the room burst open and Paul burst into the room. His eyes darted between Derek and me, and there was a mixture of rage and pain in them. What's going on here? His voice was trembling with emotion. I froze, unable to say a word. Everything I had been hiding so carefully was now on the surface. Paul, I began, but he cut me off, pulling away from me abruptly. Don't say anything, he shouted, his eyes burning with rage. I saw everything. I know everything. How could you, Jesse? How could you betray us? I felt the ground slipping away from under my feet. All my fears have now become reality. Paul knew. He was following me, and now it's over. Paul, I didn't mean to. I began, but the words stuck in my throat. Derek stood motionless, his face set in stone. He knew that this was the end. Paul came up to me, and I saw his eyes fill with tears. Why? He whispered, and it was the most painful question I couldn't answer. Silence hung in the room, and at that moment I realized that I had lost everything. Our home, our family, our life. Everything is destroyed. Paul left the room, slamming the door, and I was left alone with Derek. He came up to me and said softly, You really don't have a choice now, Jesse. You need to leave. I nodded, knowing he was right. My life is over here. I've lost everything, and the only thing left for me is to disappear. I left the hotel, leaving behind everything that was once important. The world seemed empty, just like me. I didn't know where to go, what to do next. But one thing was clear. The past could not be brought back, and now I had to start all over again, if at all possible.